Unilateral spatial neglect. So today I'm going to be talking about what unilateral spatial neglect is, how it is caused, different examples of unilateral spatial neglect, scientific journals and their findings, and lastly, I'll be discussing the graphs and tables from the journal articles and my references. To start off, what exactly is unilateral spatial neglect? So unilateral spatial neglect is whenever an individual fails to notice an area in their visual field. So this typically occurs due to a lesion on the brain, and these lesions can be found in many different areas of the brain, including the frontal lobe, the temporal cortex, and the parietal lobe. It seems that most of the most common location for these lesions appears to be on the right parietal area of the brain, and the right hemisphere is typically damaged, meaning that the most common examples of unilateral spatial neglect affect the left visual field. So, unilateral spatial neglect severely impacts the individual that it affects and can make everyday tasks difficult to navigate. So, here are some examples of unilateral spatial neglect, just what someone would see if they had it. So, these individuals that have unilateral spatial neglect often do not notice certain areas in their visual field. Here are some examples of where these individuals they were asked to draw a clock and a flower. And as you can see, the left side of the drawings are completely missing in both pictures. So the patient's brain only identifies the right side of their visual field and can only represent that corresponding side. So this is my scientific journal one, and in the scientific journal is published in 2018. The researchers attempted to discover how unilateral spatial neglect affects the symmetry of eye gaze. So they did this by having individuals with the disorder wear a pair of horizontally flipped glasses while viewing a different series of images. So the researchers wanted to determine whether or not the actual content of each image impacted the eye gaze of the individuals with the disorder or not. And they also wanted to conduct this experiment just to learn more about how patients with this disorder track objects in their daily life. And previous experiments have only focused on using computational methods to monitor this disorder, but this experiment uses a direct approach that can be used in a clinical setting to evaluate patients. So in this experiment, there were three different categories of participants. There were people that had the disorder, then there were people that had a damaged right hemisphere, but they did not have unilateral spatial neglect, and then there were healthy people with neither. So the series of images was presented to each individual in a random order, and multiple things about the patient's eye gazes were recorded. So the initial eye gaze movement was recorded, the duration of the gaze, and the gaze distribution were all recorded. And then they used ANOVA tests to determine the outcomes and compare the group's results. So the researchers discovered that the group that contained the patients that had unilateral spatial neglect actually gazed significantly more to the right than the other groups. They also had bigger or smaller amounts of fixations in the corresponding spatial area of the image presented. But whenever the image was flipped and the picture was more dominantly focused on the left side, the gaze actually shifted more to the left, which is very interesting. So these findings were very important for the future assessments of unilateral spatial neglect, and they're very important for rehabilitation purposes. So in the graphs above, the eye gazes from the participants in all three categories were tracked. So the control group was labeled as CON, and the patients with unilateral spatial neglect are labeled as USN. So as you can see on the heat maps, the eye gaze from the participants with the unilateral spatial neglect were severely shifted towards the right. But on the horizontal position graphs, the ones underneath the heat maps, the fixation proportion of the unilateral spatial neglect group is a lot higher than the other two groups. They're the red line. So in the second study, this one was published in 2016, the researchers wanted to discover how people with this disorder performed when attempting to complete a cancellation task while also dividing their attention on a non-spatial cognitive task. So previous studies had shown that increasing the amount of attention with an individual with this disorder decreases their performance on specific tasks. So to set up this experiment, the researchers tested 8 individuals with unilateral spatial neglect, 8 without it, but they did have a brain lesion, and then 8 healthy participants. So they took these 3 groups of people and they did 2 separate experiments. So in the first one, participants were asked to cross out specific shapes on a piece of paper, and they used pre-attentive and attentive searching. And they hypothesized that people that had unilateral spatial neglect would perform worse on the attentive portion than compared to the other groups. And then in the second experiment they did, they were asked to search for numbers containing 3, even numbers, and multiples of 3. So the researchers did this because they wanted to see if they added a non-spatial task, something like doing math. They wanted to see if that would impact the performance of the individuals with unilateral spatial neglect. So they predicted that they would perform worse, and they were correct. So they used ANOVA to find the results. And in experiment 1, the participants with unilateral spatial neglect performed significantly worse than participants without it. And in experiment 2, it was discovered that spatial and non-spatial tasks might interact with each other. So the amount of time that it took for the participants with the disorder was increased significantly whenever they were asked to search for multiples of 3. So this study showed that pairing a non-spatial task with a cancellation task can slow down the performance of participants with unilateral spatial neglect. So just to make it more clear, this is what the participants were doing. So in the first one, they searched for the number 3. In the B task, they searched for even numbers. And then in the third task, they searched for multiples of 3. And it was either pre-attentive or attentive for the background. This is the other journal and graph that I had. So on the left graph, you can see that there were significant more amount of emissions on the left side compared to the right side with the group that had unilateral spatial neglect, which is labeled as N+. And then on the right graph, you can see that there were more emissions on the attentive tasks with the participants than with the pre-attentive tasks. So that was very interesting, and it just shows that they are not aware of the right side of the images that they were viewing. And here's my reference page. Thank you.